Okay, welcome to part three of Lockheed Martin's UFO Secrets Revealed. I'm Pedro, and let's get into it. So, this is the last episode of this series, and what I'm going to focus on is the third claim. Lockheed Martin also has various pieces of crashed UFOs stowed away in crates, a la Raiders of the Lost Ark. If you haven't seen the first two videos, please do, because this third video will make the most sense if you've already seen the first two. So, let's start with Jacques Vallée's journals, recently released. He talks about a meeting he had in January 22nd, 2012. And here's the quote. My inquiries about the sightings near Palmdale have led me to a certain retired vice president of Lockheed, a colleague of legendary aircraft designer Ben Rich, founder of the Skunk Works. They were once in charge of studying materials picked up from crashes in Nevada. Old story, he said. The method is simple. The Air Force would call them as cleared contractors, indicating where the objects were. They would go out with trucks, gather them up, and study the materials. For some reason, funding halted and the stuff was stored away like the Ark of the Covenant at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. For a while, as the rumor goes, it was held at Class 3 storage facilities near Chatsworth. There was a contract to maintain the secure lockers. It didn't support science. So why was the research stopped? Here again, there's a straightforward answer. The military brass often shows a fundamentalist bias, where events like saucer intervention smell strongly of evil influence. But why not expose it then? I can only speculate about the answers. Until November and December, we thought Bass was close to reopening our project. Bob begged his contacts to help create an appropriate SAP, which only the CIA or the Air Force can do at this level to restart Quest. Now, that vice president was none other than James Ryder. If you saw episode one and episode two, you'll know that this is obviously the case. However, in this episode, I'm going to add an extra piece of evidence to show that yes, this was Jim Ryder because we can prove he was talking to the OSAP people at around this time. So let's go back to our good old video at Lucis Trust to hear it straight from the horse's mouth. Shall we? Let's go.
This is an interesting place. I happen to know the people who work there very well. They sold their ranch and so on. And that man is a guard. And they know that as they try to move into certain areas in that massive piece of land, it's part of Utah and Arizona. It's a very large piece of land. It's about the size of Scotland. It's a pretty good sized place. And they have found that they can't, it's difficult to get into certain areas. If you walk in there with your guns and so forth, the individuals interviewed have found that they are pushed down to their knees, and if they try to crawl, they're pushed down onto their faces, and then they can't move. Now, that's a pretty tough day.
Yeah, a tough day at the job to say the least. So that story which he just told about people at a ranch, the people he knew the ranch owners very well. Okay, that's Skinwalker Ranch. The ranch owner at the time was Bob Bigelow, and they had just sold it years later to Brandon Fugel. Now, the thing about this is that the story Jim Ryder gave right there is the exact same story from chapter one of Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. And it's also found in Jacques Vallée's journals, which were published in 2025. The journal entry is for February 2011. Oh, actually, it's February 2011. Yes. So 2 years after the event happened. In Jacques Vallée's journal, he hears the story straight from the horse's mouth from Jonathan Axelrod, which we know is a pseudonym. for Jay Stratton. Jay Stratton himself came out years later on the Weaponized podcast as Jonathan Axelrod. But when Skinwalkers at the Pentagon was published, they didn't use his real name. So, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, written by Jim Lukatsky and Colm Kelleher, the director of OSAP and the operations manager of OSAP, was published in 2021. And this speech at Lucis Press happened in 2017. Okay, in June 2017. So this is about 6 months before the New York Times bombshell revealing the existence of ATIP, which was another name for OSAP, right? So 6 months before the New York Times, Pentagon UFO program bombshell about OSAP, this man, Dr. Jim Ryder, is telling an OSAP story, which was published in 2021 and later again in 2025. But it's the same exact story. Again, remember, Jacques Vallée was a member of, worked for OSAP. So this proves, I mean, he just says it right here. He doesn't, Jim Ryder doesn't name names, but he says it. He knows Bob Bigelow very, very well. He knows what was happening at the ranch before any one of us did. Why? Because as we saw in episode 2, he was the VP of Lockheed Martin, and he tried to transfer an alien vehicle, a crashed alien vehicle that Lockheed has secreted, stowed away deep in the black budget, to Bigelow Aerospace. And that's what Jacques Vallée was talking about in this journal entry. Okay. And the Bob in Jacques Vallée's journal entry is none other than Bob Bigelow. Okay. So there you go. I mean, what more do you want? You have look at episode 1, look at episode 2. I just gave you more evidence to show that, yes, Jim Ryder did know about the crashed craft that Lockheed has, and he did try to tech transfer it to Bigelow Aerospace, but he was blocked by the CIA. Now, John Alexander, back to him, back from episode 1, Colonel John Alexander. He wrote a book that came out in 2011 called UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies, and Realities. Now, this is a very important book because as of the writing of this book, the publishing of this book, John Alexander has been an arch skeptic of the whole crash retrieval narrative. Okay, his position, at least up until 2011, was that yes, UFOs are real. Yes, they are piloted most likely by some non human intelligence. But all these stories about Roswell being a crashed UFO and that the government has been secreting these artifacts away to study them and reverse engineer them is just an urban legend. And so that's important to know that that's the main theme of this book you're about to read. So the information here is very important because uh, Alexander is not trying to make an argument for the existence of crash retrievals in this book. So whatever you have here is not intended to promote that concept. Quite the opposite. But and I'm going to compare that with Forbidden Science 6, which was published in 2017. Now, quoting John Alexander, among the people I met, this is back in 1984. Okay, so he's talking about an experience he had in 1984 when him and Ron Blackburn were trying to start the Advanced Theoretical Physics group, which we mentioned in part 1 of this series. Among the people I met was Dr. Ron Blackburn, a retired U.S. Air Force lieutenant colonel who was then working at the Lockheed Skunk Works in Burbank, California. Tall, rail thin, and bespectacled, Blackburn was as close to a functional paranoid as one can be. While I had evidence that the KGB previously had intercepted some of my calls and acted on them, Blackburn just always assumed someone was listening. When meeting in hotel rooms, he would compulsively unscrew the voice end of the handset and remove the components, even though there was no classified discussion ongoing. Our assumption was that somebody must be in charge, and we were well aware of the prevailing stories and rumors. Roswell, we assumed, was a real event. The most likely situation regarding what happened to the crash material was what we called the Raiders of the Lost Ark scenario. Our guess was that a team had looked at it but was unable to make any advances. They would therefore figuratively bury the material with the intent of revisiting it every few decades to determine if we humans had advanced technologically enough to understand how the craft operated and how to exploit it. Now, let's combine what Jim Ryder told Jacques Vallée, and let's compare and contrast it with the Ron Blackburn slash Colonel Alexander theory back in 1984. Remember, John Alexander is talking about what happened in 1984. Jacques Vallée is talking about what happened in 2012, okay, from his journal. Alexander's book was published in 2011. Vallée's book was published in 2025. Okay, both stories talk about Lockheed Skunk Works. Okay, Ron Blackburn at Lockheed Skunk Works and Jim Ryder at Lockheed. Okay, um, both stories talk about a Raiders of the Lost Ark scenario where, you know, this stuff, the some of this crash material, the chunks of metal, are stowed away in crates, like in the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark. And they reopen these crates periodically once every few years or every once every decade, who knows, to see whether or not we can finally make sense of it because it's too advanced for us to understand. So, once a generation, once every 10 years, I don't know. They open it to see, hey, have we advanced in our science to see if we can catch up to this, maybe make some headway? And in both cases, like I said, I just kind of said the third scenario. So notice too that they mention Burbank and Chatsworth. The John Alexander story talks about Burbank, and the Jacques Vallée story talks about Chatsworth. That will be important later. Okay. But you see that these two stories are parallel and they converge, even though they occurred decades apart, right? What Jim Ryder told Jacques Vallée is what they Alexander and Ron Blackburn suspected, right? And that's very remarkable. I think that this theory was mostly Ron Blackburn's because if you look at Jacques Vallée's journal for March 5th, 1990, he says, I asked Ron about his involvement with Roswell. He assured me he knew a man who did radiation tests on the crash material. It was amazing. He had a piece as large as this room, and he could lift it with one hand. The fellow's afraid to talk about it. Now, if we go back to part one of this series and part two of this series and look at everything we've learned about Ron Blackburn, um, Occam's razor, right? Parsimony would suggest that the person Ron Blackburn is talking about here is either himself or Paul Tyler. And the reason why I think it's Ron Blackburn is because Ron Blackburn is paranoid, as we saw earlier. And he had every reason to be paranoid. Okay. He knew the great secret. And he had, if we look back in part two, actually touched some of the UFO material with his own hands. Okay. Um, so he has every reason to be paranoid and always looking over his shoulder and even thinking every room he's in is bugged because he was talking about things he should not have been talking about. Okay. That's the only thing that makes sense. So I think that this theory Alexander was talking about in 2011, that was concocted in 1984, was mostly Ron Blackburn's theory because, again, he was in a position to know. And it was corroborated by Jim Ryder to Jacques Vallée in 2012, months after OSAP was unable to receive the technology transfer from Lockheed of the crashed alien craft. And again, rewatch part one and part two to understand more. Now, the mention of Chatsworth and Burbank is important. Okay, so Ron Blackburn was working at the Skunk Works in Burbank, California, and according to Jim Ryder to Jacques Vallée, there's a class three storage facility in Chatsworth, which has some of this stuff in the crates. And it just so happens that Chatsworth is a stone's throw away from Burbank. It's only a 23-minute ride. So, yeah, I think Mr. Ron Blackburn had every reason to be paranoid and every uh, possibility of finding out about this stuff. He knew, and he should not have been talking about it, and that's why he was always looking over his shoulder. Okay, now I'm gonna end this with a question, a rhetorical question. People always ask the question, well, if they're so advanced, why do they crash? Right? That's the question that people ask, right? If these non-humans have this technology that's 10 generations 50 generations ahead of ours, why do they crash? And what I want to know is, well, who says they're crashing? Okay, that's an assumption on our part. um, what I want to leave with you is this possibility. uh, what if these crashes, for lack of a better word, like Roswell or Kingman, Arizona, or Varginha, Brazil. What if these so-called crashes aren't crashes, but some form of Rorschach test on the part of the UFO phenomenon, right? Psychologists will use Rorschach tests to gauge kind of like the subconscious workings of someone's mind, right? Their thought processes, their obsessions, um, their personality, right. So, what if these aliens are dropping these flying saucers to see what our reaction is in order to gauge our understanding, right? What do we see when we see these things? Do we see a better way of killing the Russians and the Chinese? Do we see a threat to our religions? Do we see something evil? Do we see something that can make us a lot of money and should be hidden? And do we gaslight our own people and lie to them about their very existence? And if that's what we're doing, what does that say about us? So I just want to leave with that thought, and I want to leave with an invitation to look forward to my next episode, where the name of that presentation is called What the Aliens Want from Us. Maybe. Okay, so that's it for today. We are all one. Peace, love, goodness, all that good stuff. God is good. Bye.